I want to start my introduction out with a tip for those of you without marketing degrees from prestigious universities. It turns out most people don't like to be lectured by their beer manufacturers. Who knew, right? Who knew? Thoughts on election integrity, parental rights, voter ID, climate change, systemic racism are not, in fact, what many Americans want in our beer, our baseball leagues, and our airlines. We've heard a lot about the censorship industrial complex, the medical industrial complex, and now what tonight's speaker calls the stakeholder industrial complex. Many Americans find themselves not resonating with the ad campaigns of products to which they are historically loyal, but they go shopping and really have no idea where their money is going. Yes, brands have always been forever quietly or more overtly associated with causes or certain lifestyles, but something is not aligning. Our speaker tonight is here to pull back the curtain on what's truly driving business. This former president of Anheuser-Busch Sales and Distribution Company started out fresh out of business school and rode that ship quite successfully, brilliantly disembarking shortly before the Dolan Mulvaney debacle. Tonight, Bud Light could be a metaphor for many American companies. Author of Last Call for Bud Light, The Fall and Future of America's Favorite Beer, tonight's speaker addresses the story of corporate virtue signaling, DEI, ESG, shareholder to stakeholder capitalism, and what can be done about it. Since his departure from AB InBev, Anson founded Strive Asset Management together with Vivek Ramaswamy, former presidential candidate, Liberty Forum speaker, and also his high school debate partner. Their intention to get business back to the business of business. Competing against BlackRock, their goal, become the most trusted asset manager in the United States. I must share that I've been fighting some vertigo the last couple days, and I wasn't sure if I was able to participate tonight. But I was really inspired to fight for it when I read Anson's story of having his 2 front teeth knocked out the night before one of the biggest meetings of his life. So Anson has not just grit, but a passion for merit and excellence in a time when such virtues have become disparaged. I know it sounds cliche, but this really is a guy you would want to have a beer with. Anson, this mic's for you.
Wow, good evening, everybody. I could not be more excited to be here. I flew all the way from the great state of Ohio today, and this was not the California that I expected to see today. The California on the news that I see every single day looks a little bit different than this one. I haven't seen out of California any Pledge of Allegiances over the last week. I've seen a lot of Mexican flags. I've seen a lot of Venezuelan flags. I've seen a lot of Palestinian flags. But I've yet to see this, probably the first American flag that I've seen in California in a week. So I really want to say, thank you so much for having me. Alex, it's amazing to hear what you're doing as well. Congratulations and kudos to you for the fight that you're having. This is something you don't hear about in California very often. And the other folks that came up here earlier and were talking about some of the faith-based missions that they're doing in Pakistan. I feel like California needs a better PR agency, because if this is the real work that's being done in California, you guys should be able to promote this a little bit more often, because it's great to see there's freedom-loving people everywhere. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to start today, and I saw a couple people drinking beer in this audience earlier, but can I see a quick raise of hands? I mean, how many people kind of, either drink beer, have drank beer, know a little bit about beer, in this audience here? All right, a lot of folks here. I like this, good audience. So I'm going to do a little bit of branding here, and just to start things off and kind of to settle us before we get into what kind of happened with the whole Bud Light thing. So I'm going to say a beer brand, and then I would like to hear a little bit of just crowd participation about what immediately comes to your mind when you hear that brand. So the first one I'm going to say Corona. What comes to your mind? Beaches, Mexico, right? All right, how about Coors Light? Right. I have to ask this gentleman right here. I've heard both the first 2 beers are terrible. What's a good beer, really quick, before I go to the third one?
Try the German beers.
The German beers. Okay, I'm with you on those. There's some real. Well, that was my next brand. So let's do this. When you say Bud Light, what do you think when you hear Bud Light? I heard a million different things. I don't even know. For Corona, I heard beaches. I heard Spuds McKenzie. By the way, does everyone here know it's Mary Beth? Sorry. Does everyone know Mary Beth, by the way, here? If you don't know Mary Beth, I got to know her at dinner tonight. I had a wonderful dinner with her. And even more amazingly, her family used to own one of the Anheuser-Busch distributors in California. And when she was in college, she was the original Spuds McKenzie person that would go to the bars and would dress up as Spuds McKenzie and give out beers. A little round of applause for that. We also discussed, this might be a little known fact, this might have been actually the first Bud Light transgender commercial when Spuds McKenzie was actually a female dog that was dressed as a male dog. So maybe Bud Light is authentically going in a little bit of a different direction. But so the reason I just opened up with that little bit of branding and image recognition, I think it's really interesting, is most brands are built over decades. There's a lot of recognition that goes into them. It's amazing how long it takes to build a brand, and then most importantly, how fast you can ruin a brand. And what's really interesting on the Bud Light piece is Bud Light is actually, I was just making sure, I was seeing who's behind me, they were creeping up on me here, Howard, so didn't know who was I didn't know if this was going to be an Anheuser-Busch person trying to get me in the back beforehand. Oh, you're recording? That sounds about right. Well, they tend to like me these days, so, but anyway. What's really interesting, though, is that what we're going to talk about a little bit tonight is it wasn't really just Anheuser-Busch and Bud Light as a brand that really lost its way and lost its mission, but there were a lot of companies over the last 4 or 5 years that got deeply involved in a lot of social and political and progressive causes. You had Disney, as everyone recalled, they got involved in the parental rights issue in Florida. If you recall, this was the bill that said we don't want to teach kids sex education in kindergarten through 3rd grade, and all of a sudden Disney said that this was a very anti-progressive and very, crazy law, even though Disney's mission as a company is just to create world-class entertainment for individuals. You had firms like Target. Target, if you might recall, they got involved in a lot of defund the police initiatives. Once George Floyd's death happened in Minneapolis, where Target was based, they called for a lot of defunding the police. They also got involved in a lot of the LGBTQ plus initiatives. Coca-Cola tried to overturn a lot of election integrity laws in Georgia when he said you need an ID to vote. Having an ID to vote is considered now Jim Crow 2.0. I don't know, this is just me. I think the most racist thing you can do is assume somebody can't get an ID based off the color of their skin or their gender. That's just myself. But so there were a lot of companies over the last couple of years that got involved in very controversial political issues that had nothing to do with the mission of that brand. And what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is how did we get to this? How did we get to this point where so many different companies adopted so many socially progressive and political positions that were distinct from their missions? We're going to talk a little bit about why that was bad, not only for business, but why it's also bad for the democracy that we live in. And I think third and most importantly, we're going to be talking about, I think, some of the changes that have been made over the last, 6 months in terms of you're seeing the dismantling of a lot of DEI initiatives that really came from a lot of corporate America, a lot of ESG, environmental social governance initiatives that were bad for business and bad for this country. And then also talking about what we collectively need to do to safeguard and make sure we don't go back through another era that we just lived through, where every single business was dictating to us what we needed to think, what we needed to believe, what we needed to do in society. Does that work for everybody? All right, cool. So let's sort of hone out a little bit, because at the center of kind of what went wrong, I think, with American business over the last couple of years comes down to this fundamental question about what is the purpose of a corporation? What is a corporation supposed to do? And then here in the United States, for really the last 50 years, we've really subscribed to this Milton Friedman view of the world. And this Milton Friedman view of the world is that the purpose of a corporation in the United States is to serve its shareholders. And who are the shareholders? The shareholders are the people that actually own the company. They are actually owners of the shares of that company. And then how do you serve those shareholders? Well, it's pretty simple. You serve your customers. No matter what the mission is of your company, you go out and you serve those customers. You give them great products, great services. That allows you as a company to generate more revenue, hire more people, pay more taxes, be just a good kind of member of the community. That's what a business is supposed to do. But it was pretty interesting. At the same time, about 50 years ago in the 1970s, when Milton Friedman came out with this essay on the purpose of a corporation that he published in the New York Times, there was another individual named Klaus Schwab. Klaus Schwab, he's an economist over in Europe. He's the founder of the World Economic Forum, and he put forward this belief that the purpose of a corporation is to serve all stakeholders. And who can be a stakeholder in a business? Well, a stakeholder is almost anybody. A stakeholder can not only be a shareholder, but it can be activist, it can be the government, it can be NGOs. Really, a stakeholder can be anybody that doesn't even have to have anything to do with the business, but is going to be somewhat impacted or affected by that organization. And it's pretty interesting that both of these models purported to do the same thing. Both the shareholder capitalism model, which I equate to be you kind of serve one God, the shareholders, which I can understand, or the stakeholder model where you try and serve a bunch of different gods, both purported to do the same thing. They both purported to drive better economic outcomes for businesses and then also drive better economic outcomes for society. And it's pretty interesting that if you take a look at the last 50 years and you compare sort of the United States and you compare it to Europe in these two economic models, it's my belief that the American free market shareholder capitalism model, as put forward by Milton Friedman, has been far superior to this European stakeholder capitalism model in Europe. Why do I believe that? Well, if you take a look at sort of just broad-based stock market gains over the last 50 years, and you look at kind of U.S. broad-based stock market gains, here in the U.S., the S&P 500 has gone up approximately 10% per year since 1970, whereas in Europe, their stock market has gone up about 7% per year. Now, to a lot of people, that might not seem like a big difference, but if you had $100,000 invested in the stock market in the 1970s in a 401k, in the U.S., it would be worth $4.5 million today. In Europe, it would be worth $1.5 million due to that compounding of interest over time. And as we know, we have a massive financial crisis in this country. A lot of people, less than 50% of people in this country even own stocks. Fewer than that have a 401k. Most people don't have enough assets to retire. And I'm not counting and I'm not trusting the government to have Social Security around when I retire. So therefore, we need to have other mechanisms to make us be able to retire with dignity. So I think the U.S. has kind of trounced Europe on that one economic factor of stock market returns. But then also, if you look at any sort of broad-based prosperity metric. If you look at GDP growth, you look at per capita income, you look at inflation rates, you look at home ownership rates, the U.S. has trounced its European counterparts on all of those broad-based economic, on all of those measures as well over the last 50 years. So to me, it's pretty simple that this whole kind of American free market shareholder capitalism model, where companies just focus on their mission, they stay out of politics, it's been far superior. And if you think about it, if you go through like the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, I can't recall companies getting involved in any sort of political issue. I don't recall when September 11th happened, any sort of companies that were sort of self-flagellating, talking about the people over in the Middle East that have been left behind and maybe they've been oppressed. Like that just never happened as a narrative. Never happened whatsoever. Didn't happen in the 90s. It was even interesting in the 90s when gay rights was a big political issue in the 90s. Most businesses stayed out of it. Actually, Bill Clinton invited a lot of business leaders to the White House in the 1990s to talk about gay rights and the issues. And no company showed up because they said that's just not our mission. Like we just don't get involved in these issues. That's just not our thing. But it's really interesting that something really big happened in the late 2000s, where all of a sudden in the US, we started having this stakeholder model that was coming in. And one of the big things that happened was we had sort of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. You remember there were a lot of banks. These were the ones that were perceived to have gotten bailed out because they lent a bunch of subprime loans to individuals. Individuals, they lost their houses, but banks got bailed out. After that, you had Occupy Wall Street pops up, and there's this whole sort of mission that all of a sudden in the United States, finance needs to repair kind of this black eye of this capitalist system. Because even though American free market shareholder capitalism led to unprecedented wealth and prosperity in this country, of course there are some bumps along the way, with 2008, 2009 definitely being one of those bumps. The issue with that is that there were a lot of individuals that used that as really a money grab opportunity in the United States and to advance a very social and progressive mission. One of the things that also happened after Occupy Wall Street, we had Barack Obama, who was president. In 2011, 2012, he signs the first diversity and inclusion presidential mandate in the United States. where he says the federal government has to it was essentially a making sure affirmative action goes further to create a more diverse and a more inclusive federal government. That's that first diversity, equity, inclusion really initiative in the United States government really started taking hold. You had a lot of banks as well that decided that to repair our image, they started taking this European stakeholder capitalism. ESG, for example, was a term. It was first coined in 2005. It means that businesses are supposed to environmental, social, and governance issues, and that these are really the only risk that businesses should be taking a look at. Well, nobody really paid attention to it in the US. Even in Europe, it didn't really take off really until after this whole great financial crisis. And a lot of banks said, okay, now we're going to be in the business of using businesses and using our capital as banks to start forcing companies to do so-called good in society without really defining what that was. And like most things that show up in three-letter terms, whether it's the CCP or you name other three-letter terms, they purport to have a very good sort of mission. Of course, like this sounded great. Okay, businesses should, of course, do like environmentally good things, ensure socially good things. That just sounds good on paper. But in terms of the implementation of it, it really got frayed over the next 10 years. A couple other big milestones that happened that were very problematic for this movement. In 2014, you had a consulting organization called McKinsey, one of the largest consulting organizations in the United States. They put out this paper that was called Diversity Matters, Diversity Wins. And it was a whole study that they had done where they had done a study that showed that businesses that had sort of a more diverse board based off all the mutable characteristics, that these companies so-called performed better. And this is a study they did in 2014. They were never able to replicate the results of this study that they did in subsequent years that they did it, but they used this study to, of course, sell consulting services to almost every single large organization in the United States about how they were going to make their companies more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive, raking in millions of dollars of fees along the way. And then in 2016, something interesting happens where you have Donald Trump is first elected to president. And when Donald Trump is first elected, it was a real shock to the traditional system, especially the international order of things like Donald Trump pulled out of, for example, the Paris climate agreements. He pulled out of the Paris climate agreements where you were supposed to lower the world's temperatures, this international order. He pulled out of some of the international kind of human rights campaigns. And it was really interesting because a lot of progressive states in this country, California and New York, they started telling large asset managers saying, hey, if government is no longer going to solve existential crises of systemic racism or climate change or others, now we need to make sure that business is going to do this. And sort of these large asset managers that had already been dipping into the water, their toes in the water of ESG and DEI, which are really downstream of these stakeholder capitalism movements, of being able to put in political movements into really the governance of companies, all of a sudden started adopting this. Because if you're a large asset manager, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, these three organizations manage $20 trillion worth of capital. That's the same size of the GDP of the United States of America. It's a massive amount of money. And what's interesting about these asset managers, this isn't their money. This isn't like it's Bill Gates or, I don't like George Soros, but George Soros can do what he wants with his money. But what's interesting is that they were using other people's money. For example, the pensions of California, pensioners' money, the pensions of New York. They were using a lot of the sovereign wealth funds of Norway and Sweden and other places to all of a sudden they have these huge piles of money where they're the single largest shareholders in 95% of the companies in the S&P 500 in the US. They own usually between 25 and 30% of those companies, which gives them outsized ability to vote for proxy statements at companies. And you can put up, if you're a shareholder of a company, you can put up sort of proxy statements that the company will abide by. I'll get into this in a second, but also it gives you a voice with management. So in 2016, 2017, a lot of these, again, large organizations were telling BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, if you're going to manage my money, we want you to adopt more ESG and DEI policies and to manage my money. And what was interesting about this at the time, a lot of these companies were kind of hesitant because this really violates a lot of traditional fiduciary duty in the United States. If you're an asset manager historically, you had the duty to maximize returns for your clients without any look to social or political issues. That was your duty, because then you would give money back to clients. Clients could then take that money and they could donate to any cause they see fit. So for a while, there was, for the kind of 2016, 2017, 2018, there was a little bit of sort of a gray area of what should we do? Can we do this or not? So it was interesting, a lot of these firms, they started to create ESG indexes where they would start scoring companies, almost think of it as like a social credit score. And what they would do is they would say, all right, if you're a little bit more diverse and you pump a little bit less oil or use less carbons and you have better sort of transgender type policies, we are going to include you in an ESG index, of which we are going to charge investors usually 3 times the amount as a traditional fund. Usually a lot of these funds would underperform relative to the ones that weren't ESG related. But all of a sudden, Wall Street saw this as a big opportunity to try and get more people into ESG funds because they were making 3x the amount of money. And what was interesting, at this exact same time, there was a really big movement by a guy named Larry Fink, who was the CEO of BlackRock, who he started writing letters to individual CEOs every single year talking about how companies need to earn their social license to operate, or BlackRock would vote against directors and against CEOs, and they would also vote for certain policies that the companies may not like. And Larry Fink, even though that he was concerned about potentially violating fiduciary duty, one of the things that he did was he worked with this group called the Business Roundtable in the United States. The Business Roundtable is a business group that has about 200 of the most influential CEOs, of which Larry Fink was the head of it in 2018, and he got the Business Roundtable to adopt a resolution in the United States that said that we are going to evolve the purpose of a corporation in the United States away from shareholder capitalism and shareholder value, and we are going to move it towards stakeholder capital and stakeholder value, which really allowed him to sink this ESG ethos into almost every single corporation in the United States, really drive his ESG agenda, which was becoming increasingly very progressive and very politicized. BlackRock's based in New York. They have a lot of their assets come from progressive organizations. Larry Fink is more on the Democratic side of the thinking and of the aisle. And now all of a sudden he has now shifted sort of the policy of most businesses in the United States towards this stakeholder capitalism model where businesses were going to get more involved in social and political issues. And oh, by the way, when he's doing this, BlackRock makes more money because if they're putting more people into these ESG indexes, ESG funds, he can force behaviors and he can make more money along the same way. And this really set up what I say was really the kindling before what came the COVID bonfire. COVID was a strange time for a lot of people and a lot of weird things happened. But one of the weirdest things that I think happened during COVID was really the number of companies that really got blown off their mission of what they were trying to do. And there were some reasons for this initially. You know, when COVID first happened, as everyone was trying to so-called flatten the curve, you had a ton of different businesses that were doing all types of crazy things. I mean, I was at Anheuser-Busch. We stopped making beer and we started making hand sanitizer, you know, for a little bit early on. You had companies like Delta. They were flying medical supplies all around the country. You had GM and Ford are making ventilators. You had a lot of businesses that all of a sudden were doing a lot of things that were very different. And even some of this was somewhat set up, you know, even with early on in COVID, when you had a lot of people dying in New York hospitals, there was a lot of pressure by Democratic lawmakers, New York lawmakers, for Trump to sign the Defense Production Act, which essentially says you can compel organizations for national security interest to make things for national interest. Again, beer companies making hand sanitizer, Walmart's doing testing facilities in their parking lots, Google's talking about the spread of the disease. A lot of businesses were doing things not consistent with their mission, or not necessarily for creating shareholder value, but more for this stakeholder piece. The problem with that is that, as we all know, I mean, the whole issue with COVID was, you know, kind of a farce to begin with, but really quickly, this whole idea of not overrunning hospitals was done within the first month or two. By May of 2020, you didn't have hospitals overrun, and that was the whole reason that you were trying to so-called flatten this curve to begin with. And so a lot of businesses had felt they had helped with this existential crisis, and they'd done this by getting off sort of the mission of their company. But in May of 2020, a new so-called existential crisis emerges. In May, this is when you had George Floyd dies in Minneapolis. And when George Floyd dies in Minneapolis, all of a sudden the next invisible crisis is systemic racism in this United States. This is something that the whole media is talking about. This is something that a lot of business leaders are talking about. Larry Fink is one of the very first people at BlackRock that says we need to address systemic racism in this country, and we need to make sure that businesses are now doing their part. And it was really interesting that even organizations that popped up in light of George Floyd's murder, Black Lives Matter, for example, one of the key tenets of Black Lives Matter was we want to dismantle the nuclear family. And even if you disagreed with some of those tenets of Black Lives Matter, as an organization, you almost had to have a black square on your Instagram page or on your Facebook page, or you had to donate to some sort of a cause. And it was amazing to see that Black Lives Matter, within a couple of weeks, all of a sudden raised hundreds of millions of dollars for their organization without any sort of bean counting, checking, fact counting. And this was a very politicized organization, but was really compelled by a lot of the financiers on Wall Street and others to donate to BLM and to a lot of other organizations to address systemic racism. And what was really interesting after that as well is not only were organizations having to donate to BLM, but now all of a sudden, DEI became front and center in North America as part of this stakeholder capitalism movement. And you had DEI officers went up by 200%, 300%, 400%. All of a sudden, you had a lot of organizations were putting quota systems in for hiring. You had a lot of organizations as well that all of a sudden were putting in supplier mandates. You had to have a certain amount of your shelf space that was dedicated to people that were based off their skin color or their sex or their gender. Target is allocating shelf space based off race, sex, and gender. Really, really interesting things that are happening in corporate America at this time. And for myself, I'm kind of seeing a lot of these things going on. I was, I'll give you a little bit about my background. She mentioned I was president of Anheuser-Busch at the time. I was living in Atlanta, Georgia. And one of the things that really kind of got me going down the path of actually leaving Anheuser-Busch and noticing that Anheuser-Busch as a company had changed was, I don't know if you recall, in 2021, there was a Georgia Voting Rights Act that happened. And this is where the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, he said that from now on, you need to have an ID to vote. Again, that didn't seem that crazy to me. But when that happened, the first company that actually pushed back on this law was BlackRock. Larry Fink was one of the people that said that essentially this is Jim Crow 2.0. He disagreed with this law. He said, we're going to push back on this, and then we want other companies to push back on this as well. And so lo and behold, you have organizations like Coca-Cola, whose mission is just, give good drinks to the world. All of a sudden, they're now talking about systemic racism and how we need to do better and we need to be against this law. You had Delta Airlines. All of a sudden says we're against this law and we're going to put in DEI policies in terms of how we're hiring pilots, now not based off the competency of flying planes, but now we're hiring them based off of their skin color and gender and other issues. And you might recall as well, Major League Baseball in 2021, they canceled the All-Star game in Atlanta in 21. I don't know if you remember this, but this was like absolutely wild. You have Major League Baseball canceling an All-Star game in 2021 over a law that just requires an individual to get an ID to vote. And so this really got me because I was a big sponsor of that game. Budweiser, we saw a lot of beer at All-Star games, and it was going to be in Atlanta, and I was living there at the time. And when they moved it to Coors Field in Denver, I didn't sell any beer at Coors Field in Denver. I had also lived in Denver, and I know that Denver, if you think about diverse cities, Denver usually doesn't, top the list in the United States as a diverse city. It's a bunch of guys that look like myself with like a slightly better beard. And Atlanta is probably the most diverse city that I've ever lived in. And just none of these policies just kind of made any sense to me whatsoever. And let me talk a little bit about some of the changes I saw at Anheuser-Busch as well and how kind of this all came to a head at the exact same time. So when I joined Anheuser-Busch, I joined an organization that was really a meritocracy. That's one of the reasons that I joined it. It was an organization that, although historically had been run by the Bush family in the United States, and the Anheuser-Busch, it was started in 1856, amazing history and legacy. It was started around the same time. You had Vanderbilts, you had Carnegies, you had Mellons, Rockefellers, amazing families in this country. And still in the early 2000s, you still had Bushes running Anheuser-Busch, which was pretty cool. It had 4 generations before they finally, unfortunately, kind of screwed it up in the 4th generation. A quick story, August Bush IV was running the business. One of the reasons he had to leave was after he left, a couple years later, this just shows him, he's probably one of the only people in the United States that got a helicoptering under the influence, when he parked his helicopter at a fertility clinic, and when he came out of the fertility clinic, was confused why there were a bunch of police officers around his helicopter, and his helicopter was filled with beer and guns and a bunch of other different things. So they told him, "Sir, you cannot be flying your helicopter and just parking in fertility clinics." So he had some issues. The company ended up having to get sold to a company called InBev. InBev was a group of really Brazilian bankers. They kind of consolidated the South American beer market, bought the European market, InBev, which owned brands like Stella, and they bought Anheuser-Busch in 2008, 2009. I joined the company shortly thereafterwards in 2011. They had kind of recruited me to come work for what they said was one of the world's sort of like largest finance firms that happens to sell beer. And coming out of business school, that was a pretty good recruiting pitch. My background was in finance, it was in private equity. I liked beer at the time. I was 27 years old, so if I could work for a company that was kind of finance-oriented, it sold beer, and they told me it was a meritocracy where you could come in, you could get results very quickly, you could move up. That sounded pretty cool to me. So I joined the organization and had about an 11-year career where I was promoted throughout various different positions, ended up as president of Anheuser-Busch, but I think there were some key mistakes that were made by this company that was based in Europe. And a couple of them were like, one, because it was a European-based company, over time, they subscribed much more to this sort of stakeholder capitalism model as this became more in vogue, and the European Union put in a lot of aggressive ESG and DEI kind of initiatives. Secondarily, I think that a lot of the executives were somewhat out of touch with the sort of the American population. A lot of the real senior folks were from Belgium, they were from Brazil. They all wanted to live in New York City, not St. Louis, Missouri. So they moved the kind of U.S. sales headquarters from St. Midwest, Missouri to New York City. And I think just in New York City, Fifth Avenue is very different than Midwest Ohio, Midwest St. Louis or Midwest Ohio. And one of the other things that really started happening, kind of especially in the kind of post-2000 era, is unfortunately the company adopted a lot of the same ESG and DEI mandates that a lot of other corporations across the country were. And some of the reasons for this were, I mentioned earlier BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. They own 25 to 30% of every publicly traded company in this country. And in the year 2020 and 21, there were a lot of organizations, really political organizations, that started to put up pretty aggressive shareholder proposals at companies. Because once the businesses were now in the business of abiding by their stakeholders, now if you own $25,000 of any company in the United States, you have the ability to put up a shareholder proposal. And these so-called ESG proposals, environmental social governance, before kind of 2019, when this purpose of the corporation was evolved, less than 2% of these things ever passed. And these proposals, I'll give you a couple examples of what they are. There's an organization called Color of Change, for example. Color of Change is a nonprofit with the mission to eliminate systemic racism in the United States. Okay, fine, you can, as an organization, have whatever mission you want. But in 2020, they bought $25,000 worth of Apple. They put up a shareholder resolution that says, you, Apple, we want you to figure out how you have contributed to systemic racism historically in this country and what you're going to do to fix it. And Tim Cook and the board of directors at Apple, are actually a pretty progressive board. They said, guys, I understand what you're trying to do, but this is not our mission at Apple. Our mission at Apple is to make magical devices at unbelievable prices. This is important, of course, systemic racism, other things, but that's just not what we do. Yet in 2020, because of what was going on with ESG and DEI and BlackRock and stakeholder capitalism, this resolution passed by 52 to 48, with BlackRock, who owns 6% of Apple. They were the deciding vote that pushed it over the edge that this passed. So now all of a sudden Apple as an organization had to spend tens of millions of dollars hiring Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch to essentially do a racial equity audit so Apple could figure out how it contributed to systemic racism historically in the country and what they were going to do to address it moving forward, which then brought in a bunch of DEI consultants who all said that they needed to have quota systems and equity and all these other issues. And this was not a one-off example. So of these ESG proposals like this one, 40% of these were all of a sudden passing in 2020 2020 and 2021. Racial equity audits were put on companies like Home Depot, they were put on Salesforce, they're put on Apple, Disney. You had a lot of other ones that were asking to essentially defund the police or defund the military. A lot of these proposals came up telling Microsoft not to sell technology to police forces or to militaries. You had PETA, of course, PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. They were putting up proposals at Starbucks that said, we want you to stop using animal milk at Starbucks. Luckily, that one failed, but it still got almost 20% of the vote at Starbucks. So a lot of these were happening at the time, and Anheuser-Busch, unfortunately, they started to adopt a lot of the similar policies. I remember in 2020, 2021 timeframe, I saw during our annual performance reviews, we used to be a meritocracy. One of our 10 principles was we promote people based off their skills and their talents. That principle at the organization got changed to we now promote people based off the diversity of their teams. And in that year, in the performance reviews, it was very clear where each team was now shown what's your diversity of your team based off immutable characteristics of race, sex, gender, and it was very clear that you had to promote people based off of their race, sex, gender. A lot of people that didn't get promoted were white males, of course. For myself, this wasn't an issue. I was president essentially of the organization, but I had a lot of mandates coming down from our CEO and our board. That did not sit well with me as just from my own principles of meritocracy. Other things that didn't sit well with me. We had as an organization an annual survey. This annual survey said a bunch of different questions, like, do you understand the mission of the company? Are you proud to work here? Do you plan to stay in the next 6 months? And another one was how do you feel about our DEI initiatives? And it was really interesting that year in 2021, you had 88% of people said DEI is fine, just don't do anything else, don't do anything more. Whereas this was during the Great Resignation that was happening, and you had 50% of the people said they were going to leave the organization in the next 6 months. And our CEO of North America decided that we should have a 2-hour meeting every single week. Do you think it was on how do we keep the 50% of people that are thinking about leaving the organization? Or do you think it was how do we increase our DEI score from 88 to 90? In this world, it was increasing our DEI score from 88 to 90 because that got reported every single year in our annual ESG report that we started to do in 2020 that we could report to BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard to show how we're making progress on DEI and these other initiatives. And then one of the things that really was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for myself is at the end of 2021, I've been at this time working with Vivek for a couple months thinking about getting Strive off the ground in the background, but I was trying to do a deal at the time with Black Rifle Coffee Company. You guys know Black Rifle Coffee Company? No, that's right, yeah. Great company. So it's a whole mission. Black Rifles Coffee, what it is, it's a veteran organization, so founded by military veterans, and their mission is to serve coffee and culture to people who love America, which happen to be firefighters, first responders, police officers, military. And so it was a very fast-growing company. They were mostly online subscription sales, DTC, but I wanted to do a deal in partnership with them where we were going to distribute Black Rifle coffee cans to all the same exact convenience stores and grocery stores and bars and restaurants that we distributed Budweiser and Bud Light and all these other brands, because a lot of the same people that were drinking a 6-pack of Budweiser at night, they're drinking 6 Black Rifle coffees in the morning. So there was a lot of overlap in terms of the customer base. And what was really interesting, so this all made a lot of sense. We were going to make a bunch of money off this deal. It was going to be a great partnership for both of us. And when I have this whole proposal basically ready to be signed off on, our external affairs team that's based in New York City denied the deal happening. And I said, what do you mean you're denying this deal? And they said, well, we just can't do it. This brand is too controversial. They support the military, they support the police, and in the environment that we're in, it's just, we can't have anything get out that we are going, we could do a deal with them. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, this is absolutely insane. Like, we distribute Budweiser, which is one of the biggest sponsors of Folds of Honor, a military organization. I mean, we sell like really bad brands like, I don't know, King Cobra and malt liquor in 40-ounce bottles. Like, that's not like, the best brand in the world. And you're telling me that we can't do a deal with Black Rifle Coffee Company because essentially of your politics of somebody who's living in New York City and is looking at the lens, not through our customer base of who's our customer, and we as an organization, we're supposed to be creating a future with more cheers, and that involves being able to distribute brands like Black Rifle Coffee Company, but we also owned a bunch of very progressive craft breweries that sponsored LGBTQ type initiatives as well, and our whole thing is that we should have different brands for different customers. And they essentially said, nope, we're not going to do it, denied it. And that to me was kind of where I saw how really corporate America had been hijacked in such a large way, where now corporations, they weren't necessarily focused to their mission and to their shareholders and to their customers, but much more so were concerned about their stakeholders. And at that point, that's when I decided to leave Anheuser-Busch. So I left at the beginning of 2022. Jane mentioned it earlier. I was very fortunate in my life that I met the smartest person I've ever met in my life when I was 15 years old in high school. My debate partner was Vivek Ramaswamy, and so we were on the exact same mock trial team in high school. We were good buddies in high school, went to similar colleges, always kept kind of in contact. And in that, the end of 2021, we were kind of having a lot of discussions at night. It was COVID, you had a bunch of time to have discussions at night. And both Vivek was frustrated because at his biotech company he was at, he was being pressured by his board to make statements on BLM or on policing initiatives. And he was saying the same thing around, I started this biotech company to make life-saving drugs and medicines. That's the mission of this company. That's what's going to make it successful. I didn't start it to be a political organization. And so that kind of dovetailed with a lot of the things that I was seeing in Atlanta and at Anheuser-Busch. And so that's when we decided to create the company called Strive Asset Management, which we just wanted to be the most trusted asset manager in the world. We were just going to do the thing that we always said we were going to do. We were here to maximize financial returns for our customers, period. And how are we going to do that? Is we were going to abide by the rules of American free market shareholder capitalism, as Milton Friedman said, where we were going to invest into businesses and ask them just to be authentic to their mission, period. Don't get involved in social and political issues that are going to be, one, divisive for your customer base and are going to make you lose revenue. And I think one of the least sustainable things you can do as an organization is essentially with what happened with Bud Light. But then also we thought that'd be better for democracy. Instead of having this small group of CEOs which are going to speak out on every single social and political issue, which all tended to be more progressive because they had to abide by the rules of BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard, we said just stick to your mission. That'll be better for democracy. Let individuals decide at the ballot box what policies we want to live by as it relates to policing issues or military issues or climate change issues or transgendered issues. So we started up Strive, and what was really interesting is then about a year after we started Strive, this is when, on April Fool's Day, so April 1st of 2023, this is when you had the Dylan Mulvaney and Bud Light campaign that happened. And when I first saw this, my jaw about hit the floor. And, it first happened, I saw it, and probably like a lot of people, it really came to a head. Does everybody remember the old video of Kid Rock, with his AR-15 and, basically gave, this is what I think about Bud Light, and he shot up sort of the cases of Bud Light. And I really think that was just really, Kid Rock releasing a feeling that so many Americans had of just being sick and tired of being lectured to by Disney, which had been lecturing folks earlier, by Target, by Nike, and the whole Colin Kaepernick piece. I don't like Ben & Jerry's the brand, but I actually respect Ben & Jerry's because at least they're open and authentic about who they are. They say we use ice cream to basically sell a social progressive mission, and I don't mind if that's your mission, they're open and authentic about it. But so many businesses that don't have an authentic mission that's socially progressive were lecturing. And so I think really that Kid Rock video, that was really a release of just the frustration of the last couple of years of so many people being censored, so many people being called bigots or racist or anything if you questioned ESG or DEI policies. And so it was really interesting when that happened, all of a sudden you had Bud Light sales that dropped 10% that first week. And it was really interesting because the marketing, a bunch of companies make boneheaded marketing mistakes all the time. A lot of people in this room can probably recall like New Coke, when New Coke came out. And New Coke used to be the worst marketing decision of all time until the Bud Light piece. But the interesting thing about New Coke was they at least said we screwed up and they brought back old Coke really quick and then Coke went and was fine. The interesting thing about the whole Bud Light piece and why this sort of captured everything that went wrong in corporate America was sales dropped 10%. The first response that you get from Bud Light is, oh, we did this collaboration and we do it to celebrate milestones. It was some just banal kind of corporate response. And after that, sales dropped 20% because their customers saying, well, what's the deal? Is Dylan Mulvaney now the new Spuds McKinsey? Is that essentially the face of Anheuser-Busch? And so you have more people chiming in. It becomes all over the news. And what I think a lot of people, especially in New York City, didn't realize is just how controversial the whole sort of transgender movement had become in the United States, where when people were asking for biological men to compete against women in sports, and people were asking for gender affirmation care, and Dylan Mulvaney became really the face of this. Dylan Mulvaney was at the White House with Joe Biden, basically advocating for all of these issues. And if you recall, 2-3 years ago, you had half the states at the time. Usually the legislative session tends to happen in most states kind of in the February, March, April timeframe. Half the states in the United States had ballot issues up related to gender affirmation care, about biological men competing in sports. The week leading up to this as well, that's when you had the transgender shooter at the Christian school in Nashville as well. So there's all of these issues were on the ballot, and you could not have picked sort of like a worse person to be the new Bud Light spokesman, so to speak. And the interesting thing about it is that on April 15th, you actually had sort of the first corporate response from Anheuser-Busch because the sales were just plummeting. And at this time, I really think that Anheuser-Busch, they had a choice to make. And this choice was very simple. You either go out and you say, what was truly authentic to Bud Light. And historically, Bud Light became the biggest beer brand in the United States because it was remarkably apolitical. It was enjoyed by Democrats and Republicans alike, if you looked at any statistical surveys about who their customers were. And it did that because it never got involved in politics. It was all about humor, sports, music, fun. It was things that brought people together. I mean, when you were drinking a Bud Light, you were having a good time. That's what essentially Bud Light was. Remember earlier today when I asked you what you think of when you think of Bud Light, and nobody could remember it? If I asked you that 2.5 years ago, everyone would have said fun or sports. That's what Bud Light was. And so authentically, Bud Light was never with Dylan Mulvaney. So they could have come out and they could have said, you know what, we screwed up, we made a mistake, we never should have done this before because Bud Light was never a political brand. And then I really think a lot of these issues would have gone away. Of course, you would have had kind of a woke mob for a week or so would have been upset about it, but a lot of those people don't drink Bud Light anyway. And then the other thing that they could have said was, they could have said, well, you know what, we're evolving Bud Light. And I don't know if you recall this, but there was also the lady who was running Bud Light at the time, named Alyssa Heinerschneit. She was on a podcast a day or two before the Dylan Mulvaney piece, and essentially said that Bud Light was this kind of fratty, out-of-touch beer, and she was going to take it in a different direction. And so if the new direction of Bud Light was going to be, we're essentially Ben & Jerry's, and we're going to be this more socially progressive brand, and we're going to be advocating for all the things that Ben & Jerry's does of defunding police and transgender issues, and you kind of name it, they could do that as well. It's a corporation. Now, I think they would have lost a lot of their customers, and they probably would be in a worse position than they are now, but they have that right also. But the problem is that they didn't do either. And I think there's a great quote from, essentially it's from Teddy Roosevelt that says, when you're faced with a tough decision, the best decision is the right one. The second best is the wrong one. And the worst decision is no decision at all. And that's essentially what happened with Bud Light. Bud Light decided to try and walk through the middle of a cultural warfare, and they got shot at from both sides. On one side, they have their loyal customer base, who they knew who drank Bud Light, which was a little bit of that fratty, out of touch, fun. That was sort of like the customer a little bit. But on the other side, they have all of these commitments that they had made to BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and to the stakeholder capitalism model, and to the ESG reports they had started to create in 2020 and 21, talking about all the initiatives that they were going to do to get their perfect score. For example, the Human Rights Campaign, which is a very progressive LGBTQ organization that scores every company in the country. Everyone used to take pride in their 100% score that they would get. How would you get a 100% score? You have to do so many marketing campaigns to LGBTQ+, and have transgender care and all these other issues. And so it was really interesting that they were caught, and so they decided to do nothing. And what was interesting, when they decided to do nothing, not only did their loyal customer base walk away, but all of sort of the progressive customer base walked away as well. And what's interesting about Bud Light is that you have your sales are tracked every single week. So all the data from Walmart and Kroger and Vons and Albertsons gets aggregated by data collectors, and they will show you every week sort of the sales dropping. And so sales all of a sudden dropped from 10% to 20% to down 30% after they did not come out in either direction. And it was interesting, so all the Pride festivals dropped Bud Light of even wanting to be a sponsor after this. All of their conservative people dropped them as well. And again, it was a brand without an identity. And now today, you have Bud Light that quickly lost its #1 spot as the most popular beer brand in the United States. They lost to Modelo. Now they're, I believe, the 3rd largest beer brand in the United States after Michelob Ultra. Their sales have dropped almost 50% since this happened with Bud Light. Bud Light, again, was the biggest beer brand in the United States. It was responsible for about 40% of the sales of Anheuser-Busch in the United States. And since that has happened, Anheuser-Busch as a corporation has had to lay off thousands of employees. A lot of their suppliers have gone out of business. A lot of individual family-owned businesses. Mary Beth, her family used to have a distributor. They sold it at the right time, so they're not there anymore. But a lot of these businesses have had to sell or go out of business. And what's really interesting about this is, to this day, Anheuser-Busch has not apologized. And I always think that Americans, for the most part, are pretty forgiving people and love comeback stories and love second chances. But really the path to, I would say, like redemption, it goes through forgiveness. But to be forgiven, you have to admit that there was a mistake. And they are not able to do it. There was even a CBS interview that happened going into July 4th weekend of 2023, so 2 years ago. And this is when the CEO, for the first time, and he's not been on TV since, the CEO of the U.S., a guy named Brendan Whitworth, he went on CBS News to try and address this situation because the sales were so bad and beer sales were plummeting, and the biggest beer selling weekend of the year is July 4th. And the CBS host first thanked them for coming on and said most people in your kind of shoes would be running for the hills by now. And the first question they asked him was, knowing all you know now, would you say this was a mistake and would you do it again? And he gave this very mealy-mouthed, wandering, well, it's complicated and challenging and this and that. And after this long-winded answer, the host came back and said, just so you're clear, the reason your sales are so bad is because the answer you just gave. So let me ask it again. Was this campaign a mistake, and would you do it again? And again, he gave another mealy-mouthed answer and didn't answer the question. And because he couldn't, because he would not, one, be able to take his customers, the loyal customer, by saying it was a mistake. Or two, he wasn't able to therefore keep their high ESG scores. It was kind of funny as well. At some point, the CEO, Brendan Whitworth, was at a UFC fighting event with Kid Rock. They had some sort of conversation, and Kid Rock was on a Joe Rogan podcast, and Joe Rogan was asked about this after Joe Rogan said, what's it like being the guy that killed Bud Light? And he said, it was interesting. I talked with Brendan Whitworth, the CEO, and he said he was coached. He basically said he could only say certain things, and the board of directors, which again is very European, stakeholder capitalism based, they essentially said you cannot say this was a mistake, you can't take any accountability for it. And with that, I don't think that the Anheuser-Busch in the U.S. is ever going to regain sort of the prominence that it once had. I don't think Bud Light will ever become the largest beer brand again in the United States. And I think at really this point, it probably makes most sense for a company like InBev, which is again based in Europe, to probably sell Anheuser-Busch in the U.S. That's, I think, the only path to redemption for that company here, because you have to bring in a new management team that can actually say you're sorry, to actually get redemption and forgiveness, and to get back on the path to growth. And then at that point, I think Americans love a great comeback story. And I think a lot of people in this room would probably, if you had new management, said you screwed up, said Bud Light's going to be now about like fun, music, bring back Spud McKenzie and some of the great campaigns you once saw, I think they could get back on track. And I think that's true for Anheuser-Busch, but I think that's true for a lot of other businesses as well that have screwed up over the last couple of years. So with that, I'm going to, I know that I've gone about an hour at this point, so I'm going to end it right here. We're going to probably, I think, do some Q&A, but I really want to thank everybody for the time and for having me out here tonight.
I tucked your book right under the podium there. I wonder if you'll hold it up, because it really is a terrific book. And it's actually almost a very, not a love letter, but it's awfully nice that you gave this back to your colleagues at Bud Light. It ends with suggestions. I thought it was very kind of nice. What has your reaction been from your former colleagues?
Well, it hasn't really been a love, a love back and forth. But it's funny, you've been. A lot of people have mentioned this almost reads like a love letter, because I think, like a lot of people, I did love this company. And I think that Anheuser-Busch as an organization used to embody, I always said, Budweiser was the American dream in a bottle to a large degree. It was this amazing story of an entrepreneurial story, a company that had survived Prohibition, a company that had survived multiple world wars, a company that had survived a lot of ups and downs, a lot of family tragedies. And it was a company that was involved in every single local community because of distributors like Mary Beth's family that got really into the culture. And why this company became unique is that it was really able to get into every single local event and every single kind of venue and sponsorship. And I don't know about you, but most of I know a lot of the best days of my life, there tended to be, a beer there when I won sports championships or when I got married or when I was at friends' weddings. And so I just really, enjoyed the company. It was really sad to see a company really lose its North Star, lose its mission, and see so many people get fired, so many distributorships have to sell, or people go out of business. So, a lot of people, I got a lot of the wholesalers reached out and said thank you. They really liked it, but a lot of people at Anheuser-Busch, I think, are probably still frustrated that I wrote the book.
Okay, fair enough. I want to talk about some of the values of this company, because this is really an amazing American company, and I think people like that. People like to have companies from their country, right? What did it mean? What was the meaning? What did it reflect about America that they had that 9/11 ad, the quiet ad? What did that say about us as a country?
Yeah, I think one of the most iconic ads of all time that Anheuser-Busch probably did was, you might recall, after 9/11, they actually ran this ad one time, and it was at the Super Bowl in 2002. So their Super Bowl ad for Budweiser, it was this very reverent ad that had kind of the Clydesdales getting ready and kind of like the cold and the wind and the rain, and then it had them kind of going through, I guess it would have been like somewhere in kind of New Jersey, and then it was on kind of a hill overlooking where the Twin Towers used to be, and then they had the horses where they all kind of like took a knee and they bowed, and it was just this sort of very reverent kind of just commercial, and it was one of the most iconic ads of all time, and it was one of these ads that only had to run one time that still people remember this to this day. And this was just sort of a company that just understood sort of the American psyche, the American spirit, kind of could capture that feeling of the U.S., never did it in an overtly kind of political way, but just really kind of got where the U.S. was at any one given time. And that's, I think, what has really gotten away when, unfortunately, it's now been acquired by this foreign company that I don't think shares a lot of the values. And a lot of these foreign organizations, they're more beholden to whether it's Europe and European laws, Chinese laws. And I really think that that's a threat for a lot of businesses and threat for American culture if you're having these values that are piped into the country from outside organizations. So that's what's been sad to see change over the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. Would you give a little bit of the backstory? Because I think everybody has a relationship with this brand, whether you drink alcohol or not. And actually, I want to share a story from my family. There's someone I love, not my husband, but there's someone I love that had a widowmaker heart attack unwitnessed and survived it, woke up 3 days later in the hospital, and he was a super fit guy, had it while he was running, very lean, could not have been more shocked that he was in the hospital with a heart attack. And after the doctor spoke to him for a couple minutes, he said, "This is serious. This is true." He said, "Could I have a bud?" That's how ingrained that is in the Midwestern culture. So the Clydesdales that were celebrated used to celebrate after Prohibition, that was linked to freedom, right? Could you tell that story a little bit about how the Clydesdales went to the White House? Or
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely linked to freedom. I mean, just a quick background on Prohibition. It happened with I'm trying to think, the 18th Amendment, I think, in 1920 or 21 or so. Whole history to it. Obviously, it didn't really work. People still continue to drink alcohol in this country during Prohibition. Then during the Great Depression, when they were looking to create jobs, they decided, okay, well, let's bring back alcohol production and distribution. And so so that's when they actually commissioned the Clydesdales. And the Clydesdales, they delivered actually the first beer to the White House in 1933, as I believe when it was. And it really was to celebrate freedom and economic growth and being able to make your own decisions and not have really the government interfere and impinge on your lives. So there was very much that was intertwined. Also, I mean, even during World War II, there was if you go to Pearl Harbor on the USS Missouri, Anheuser-Busch, they manufactured a lot of parts for the government during World War II. During Prohibition, I mean, the company, they got involved in a lot of non-alcoholic brands. They started doing refrigerated rail cars. I mean, it really is a story of resilience, and a company that, because it's been around since 1856, I mean, it shares so much of the history of this country as well, which is pretty unique.
So a lot of questions from the audience, so I want to get to them. And let's start with this. What's happening with the World Economic Forum since Trump's been in office? Do you think things changed, or are they still having the same influence that they had beforehand in terms of culture and business?
Well, I mean, if you've been reading about the World Economic Forum, and I don't think they had the culture that they always thought they did. There's been a lot of now complaints against Klaus Schwab that he ran an organization that was discriminatory, one that was sexist, one that was racist, and these are all the things that he was virtue signaling, telling everybody else to do, yet he had a lot of problems kind of internally. So I think the World Economic Forum has lost a lot of its shine. I think a lot of the days of having sort of global elites taking private jets to mountain towns in Switzerland and then shaming everybody else and telling everyone else what they need to do to adjust climate change. I think that people are tired of that, so that's good to see. And then I just think that the organization, it's kind of eaten itself a little bit. So hopefully it loses its influence. And instead of having global organizations, we'll go
Poor
back
Klaus.
to... Yeah, what's that?
I said poor Klaus.
Yeah, I'm sure he's doing all right still.
Yeah, he's gonna have to get a hobby.
Yeah.
Question about Moody's. Moody's downgraded the United States credit rating. Do you think, do you think that that's in sharp contrast to what's going on coming from the administration? So do you think that was driven by political bias?
No, I mean, I don't think it's really driven by political bias. I think like Moody's, that is more driven just by the financial, the financial situation that we're in. You know, we're spending $3 trillion a year on debt service right now. I mean, the federal debt has grown from $10 trillion to $36 trillion really over the last 10 to 15 years. And it's a problem that we have to address. And to address debt, there's only two ways to do it. You grow your income or you cut your cost. And I think, unfortunately, even with the efforts that we've seen from DOGE, we haven't been able to cut a lot of the costs that we thought we could to service that debt. And so the only other way now to really address it is you have to have economic growth. And we haven't necessarily seen a lot of the economic growth that Trump has planned yet. I think it's coming. But there's going to be maybe a little bit of pain short term to get there. And so I'm optimistic long term that we'll have strong economic GDP growth. But that's what has to get us out of this. Otherwise, we're going to have to start slashing entitlement programs, or we're going to run into further debt issues in this country.
Okay. Some questions about BlackRock from the audience. It's ditched its efforts moving away from ESG, going to, what is it called, transition
economy.
Investing. That sounds nice. Is that a greenwashing term? And let me follow up with those, because everybody's affected by BlackRock almost. Most people in this room are affected by it because they own so much of the companies that you also may be invested in. So the question is, what's the agenda behind BlackRock? You know, what's the end game? And of course, since we're at the forum, it's not a surprise. Is BlackRock a CIA deep state front?
No, that's a good question. So I don't think they're a CIA front, but I do think that Larry Fink and BlackRock is kind of the ultimate chameleon. And I think why it's very important to, I think, remember, one of the reasons that I wrote this book is I just wanted people to remember like why American free market shareholder capitalism is the best system known to mankind to raise people out of poverty and then also to improve economic conditions, and why no matter who the next administration is, we can't go back to a system where you had all these businesses taking social and political issues, dividing their employees, dividing their shareholders, because I'll tell you what, like companies in China aren't doing that. While Apple's spending their money on racial equity audits, I can tell you whoever the Apple of China is, they're not doing doing these things. And we as a company, or we as a country, we will lose our technological advantages that we have. We will lose a lot of our cultural advantages that we have. And so therefore, I think that we have to remember that we need to get back to sort of the fundamental principles of what made this country great, and that's really American free market shareholder capitalism. BlackRock, if they're using transition investing or other investing, one of the things that makes me a little bit nervous is that they are just going to go back to what they were doing if a new administration comes in. And I think that's one thing that we just have to be very cautious of, and we got to continue to call people out, and that's why we created a company called Strive. And Strive, we said, we'll be the most trusted because I don't care who the administration is, we're just going to keep doing the exact same thing that we're doing. We're investing to maximize shareholder returns, period, not going with whatever sort of the current thing is to do. We're doing what is the right thing, which is making folks money, and then we'll allow them to donate to whatever cause they see fit.
Okay. Some companies are kind of softening on DEI, right? Netflix, Coinbase, right? Lowe's, they've backed down. What's been their experience?
I think it's been very positive. I think for most companies, they realized that DEI was incredibly divisive. When you think about DEI, the diversity piece ended up being kind of quota systems. The equity piece ended up being that even when people were putting the companies in quota systems, then they had to get basically promoted at the same exact level based off of whites and blacks that are the same place. And the inclusive piece was really about exclusion, because if you question these policies, you would get fired. And it's kind of funny when you go back to original DEI, so it really has its roots really in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says you do not discriminate based off of race, sex, color, national origin, et cetera. And even at the time, the Senate floor leader when that got passed was Hubert Humphreys, who later became Lyndon Johnson's vice president. And he said that if this ever leads to quota systems, I will eat my hat. That was his sort of saying that he had. And it was really interesting that even when affirmative action came out, the policy of affirmative action was upheld in a couple of different Supreme Court decisions. The first one was Bakke versus State of California, and they upheld affirmative action, but what they actually shot down was, at the time, there was a student that wanted to get admitted to University of California's medical school, but at the time, that school had 16 slots specifically reserved for minorities. And they did strike down saying you cannot have that quota system. You can't reserve a certain amount of spots for people. Now, you can take sort of race into consideration as one factor. And then, that was in 1978. There was another Supreme Court case in 2003. It was at University of Michigan, and it was a law student, Grunwald versus, I'm trying to think of the name, but this is the second affirmative action case that came up. And again, they struck down quota systems because if you were a minority candidate, you automatically got a bump in the scoring system that was essentially a quota system. And they struck that down again, but they said you could still take in race-based considerations for other reasons. But Sandra Day O'Connor, at the time, she said that at some point, all of these race-based considerations need to go away. And she said, in 25 years, these should not be here. And this was in the year 2003. So, almost, it wasn't 25 years, but essentially 22 years later, we have been able to dismantle a lot of these DEI programs because essentially, reverse racism is racism. It is racism. And so therefore, I think a lot of companies are now realizing this, and it was really interesting because the worst amount of quota systems that we have had in this country in the last 50 years were all in 2021, in 2022, and 2023, where you had companies like Coca-Cola. They essentially had a policy that said 33% of all lawyers that we hire will be black. Target said we're going to dedicate 15% of all of our shelf space to certain minority groups. Salesforce said 40% of all of their employees will be minority candidates. And so essentially when this happens, to hit these targets, you have to do reverse discrimination. And so there's now a lot of lawsuits that are happening. So there are lawsuits that are happening right now where now Costco's been sued, Starbucks has been sued. There was actually a Supreme Court case this week as well where there was a white woman in Ohio where it was found that she was discriminated against because she was applying applied for a position. She didn't get it, but it was given to an LGBTQ member. And then this white female, she was demoted, and her position was given to another LGBTQ member. And then there was a LGBTQ was the manager of the entire piece. And so they've shown that essentially, like, there's now a lower bar that if you're getting discriminated against for reverse discrimination, that's still discrimination. So I think a lot of companies are now walking back because they're going to lose a lot of money in lawsuits. And I also think it's the right thing to do, that you should hire. I was on a panel recently about this, but I think one of the biggest problems with the whole DEI agenda was that was the first filter for candidates. What sort of immutable characteristic do you have that checks a box and to put you in? Whereas I always think what companies should be hiring for is certain skills that people have. You know, if you're a firefighter, police department, I want people that are brave, people that are strong, people that are, you know, you name it. If you're in the healthcare, I want people that are caring and empathetic. And I think if you hire for those qualities, you'll naturally get a diverse workforce.
Again, white privilege logic that you're using right there.
No, that's it. So.
You've offended everybody. We have a question about AI. What impact do you believe AI will have on gross domestic product, the GDP? And they've written an equation here, and it says economic growth minus BlackRock equals Aladdin.
So for folks that don't know, Aladdin is BlackRock's sort of software system that they have, and it makes a lot of recommendations on what people should put in their portfolio. And BlackRock gives this Aladdin product away for free to a lot of financial advisors. And this Aladdin product is so silly. You can put together a portfolio, and then it'll show you like the climate risk of your portfolio or the ESG scores of your portfolio. So it's kind of their Trojan horse in about how they score companies and they recommend companies. So I'm not a big fan of Aladdin. That's another problem that somebody else needs to create a company to take out. But in terms of AI, I don't know. I'm more of a techno optimist, because every single technology revolution in the long run has led to unprecedented prosperity and growth in this country. And there have been some sort of bumps along the way, but if you look at going from an agricultural society to an industrial society to a technology-based society, technology-based to, I think, AI, I think that we're going to have just unprecedented growth. And I think people will, like, if you're not using AI in your daily life, I challenge you all to go on to ChatGPT and just ask certain things. Like, I go on a trip with some of my high school buddies every year, and we go to one of the national parks every single year. And I was planning it this year, and I said, find me put a 5-day itinerary together for going to national parks and having some beers and hanging out with some buddies of mine in the Pacific Northwest. And I mean, it literally just put a whole 5-day itinerary together, whereas that used to take a lot of time to research. I mean, simple things like that. So I think that it's going to make people just more productive. And of course, I think that there will be certain jobs that are at risk. Like if you're a paralegal at a law firm, that's going to be tough. Like it just is, because that's expensive work, and AI can replicate a lot of that. A lot of marketing jobs, doing marketing, that's going to be tough, but you're going to still need people to have the prompts and still need people to put together the content. And I think that long term, I think it's going to usher in a lot more prosperity. And so I'm not as fearful as probably other folks are. But short term, there will definitely be some bumps along the way.
Okay. So I want to circle back around to, has Alex left the room? There she is in the back. I always want to acknowledge Alex when we talk about this, because do you see a parallel with what happened during the shutdowns and the vaccines and the mandates with what happens with ESG? In other words, is the government using the private sector to do their dirty work?
Yeah, I think 100% they are. And I think one of the things that especially the left has gotten very good at, anything that they can't get done through the front door of government, they have gotten it done through the back door of corporations. And because they realize a lot of the policies they have are not politically feasible for the general population to elect either candidates or to put through things of biological men competing against women in sports, defunding the police, requiring IDs to vote. These are a lot of things, common sense policies, so they would never sort of pass in a general election. But it was much easier for them if you can get sort of BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, get all of that capital, force companies, and it's again, this Larry Fink's words, not mine, forcing behaviors at companies to put in an ESG agenda. That's just a lot easier. And there's no accountability to it. It's almost a very, call it European or really sort of like a Chinese way of doing business. You just sort of just force policies, force behaviors in an unelected manner. I think what's nice about the United States is that we still have, folks like yourselves that that vote with your wallets. And all of a sudden, people started voting with their wallets. And really, Bud Light was that really seminal kind of turning point where all of a sudden, that was when a lot of corporations did start walking away, even before Trump came into power, where a lot of them started backing away from DEI. Tractor Supply Company, after the Bud Light issue, they started backing away. Walmart started backing away. Harley Davidson, a lot of other companies just said, you know what, this isn't consistent with my mission, with my customers, with our values. We're walking away from a lot of these policies. So, good to see.
I understand that the pharmaceutical industry is the top funder of the HRC that you described, right?
Yep.
Which is heavily invested in the gender transition issue and all of that. So this is significant.
Yeah, you follow the money. And so if they can make more money right? off of different surgeries and care and other things afterwards.
Patients for life.
That's it, patients for life.
Right. So speaking of money, no one teaches economics and finance in an understandable way right now. And certainly we don't teach it in school. Do you think it's possible to message Americans about the looming financial crisis in a way that they can be constructive?
Yeah, instead of teaching gender ideology in high school, I wish we would just teach basic finance to people. I think that would make a lot more sense as a course to have. So I think, but I wish high schools would do this. My wife, she ran for school board at our school because they were teaching a lot of gender ideology in our local high school. And we said, this just doesn't make any sense, using preferred pronouns and doing all kinds of studies about how you talk to people in certain different ways. And we said, this is ridiculous. And I think parents need to speak up, and I think parents need to be the ones that take responsibility for not only teaching their own kids, because I think that the nuclear family really is the best governance structure you can have, and people, they do need to take responsibility for passing on their own knowledge. But then also, I do think that schools, they should really supplement that so everyone has a basic understanding just of not only our government and our constitutional system, but just a basic understanding of how the government gets financed, how finances work, how economics work. And I think that would just be better for us as just kind of co-equal citizens to have this understanding that we're all in this together. And even though that you might not have benefited from the debt, you're going to have to pay for it in the future.
Yeah. Anson, if merit is no longer an American value, what will happen to this nation?
I think this nation falls apart. The greatest currency I think that this country has really is the American dream, and really is this idea that it doesn't matter who you are, if you're black, white, gay, straight, Democrat, Republican, who cares, but you can come to this country and you can work, and that you, within a generation or two, you can climb up the economic ladder, and that you can have unparalleled prosperity, where that just doesn't exist in other countries. Other countries, they have, case systems. Other countries, they don't have the economic mobility that we have. And so the merit is really that sort of defining piece that sets, I think, this country apart from almost every other country in this world. So if you lose merit, I think you lose the American dream, and then you really lose the American experiment as well.
That's big. So I do want to tell you, I have some breaking news. Karen Bass has evidently declared a curfew, a nighttime curfew in LA. Evidently, she wants you to make sure that you set cars on fire only in broad daylight. Okay.
I thought that these were peaceful protests.
These are our peaceful protests. Yes. Anyway, just don't want you to miss out on the breaking news, but this is where we are. If we lose merit, if we lose rule of law, we're really a different nation. So, Anson, I want to just share this question, because a couple people have this. Do you or Vivek see a pathway going forward where you guys buy Bud Light? And they want your phone number if that's the case, because they want to invest.
Yeah. No, I would love the opportunity to do it. And I think that, as I said it earlier, I think it makes a lot of sense for the current owners to sell it back to Americans, because I don't see this company recovering anytime soon with sort of the current leadership in place, and especially how you build brands and you sell brands in sort of this world we're living in, where podcast and earned media and storytelling are really paramount to build brands, and that this organization can't do it. They're sort of nameless, they're faceless, there's no story. They had their opportunity to get onto TV, tell a story. They didn't do it, and they haven't even been on, their CEO hasn't been on TV since. And so I really think that if you bought Anheuser-Busch, and I've been in contact with some people to potentially explore it. They're not selling it yet, but if things continue to get worse, maybe they will. But I actually think, if you you bought it, it was American-owned once again, and you kind of told this story of, hey, we bought this, we're bringing it back to America, we're bringing it back to American values, we have a new group, we're sorry for their old regime, what they did. I think that you could have an immediate bounce back in terms of sales and share, especially if you brought in sort of the right people with the brand. And I think you could lead one of the most, one of the greatest corporate American comeback stories of all time.
Right. And one of the most amazing stories of all time are these great American brands that you shared in your book. By the way, if you have a book that you'd like to sign, Anson is offered to do that if you'll meet him down to my right after the event. Anson, we always ask our speakers for our final question, really, what do you hope they'll do with this information? We learned a lot from you tonight. How can we in Silicon Valley get up tomorrow morning and support merit?
Yeah, I can put a point myself. Don't invest in any of the BlackRock funds. So that's that's an easy one. But I think that one of the biggest things that's been problematic over the last couple years, and it's changing now, but fear is contagious, but courage is contagious also. And there were a lot of people over the last couple years that were very afraid to speak up for things that they believed in. And it was really interesting when we launched Strive 3 years ago, and we just said we're about American free market shareholder capitalism, we're about free speech, we're about the American dream, we're about upward mobility, is we were branded as anti-ESG, anti-DEI, anti-all these things. But we always proclaimed ourselves that no, we are pro-American free market shareholder capitalism, we're pro-meritocracy, and we're pro these issues. And when we started speaking up, it was amazing to see the amount of people that also raised their hand and said, yes, I've been looking for this voice. And so I think for yourself to get out there and be on social media or to write op-eds or to talk to your local politicians, if you don't speak up, the other side will. And the other side, they have a big advantage in terms of media, and they have a big advantage in terms of a lot of politics even in the state. But when you start speaking up, you realize there's a lot of people that kind of believe the same things that you do as well. And as we've seen in the last year or so, I think the majority of this country believes in a lot of the things, a lot of the values of free speech, meritocracy, the American dream. We got to keep those things alive for our kids and grandkids and so on down the line. I want to make sure that the American dream, it lasts forever and not just election away from it being stolen away.
Anson, I want to thank you so much for bringing the American dream back to the Liberty Forum and for being a proponent of it. And we thank you so much for sharing your story and your speaking out. And Anson Frericks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our presentation. Please like and subscribe to our channel to get updates on new speakers, and consider joining the Liberty Forum of Silicon Valley. You can do so at our website. If you don't want to join, but want to support the principles of American liberty, you can make a tax-deductible donation via our website. The links are in the description. Thank you again, and stay free.